Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress this week, answering questions on a spectrum of issues related to how and why an estimated 87 million users' data was improperly shared with Cambridge Analytica, a British political consulting firm. On both Tuesday and Wednesday, Zuckerberg faced off with US lawmakers on data privacy, regulation measures and content safety, among other issues. After 2 days of hearings spanning 10 hours and around 600 questions from over 90 lawmakers, what questions have been answered? Has there been a greater understanding about who should and how better to regulate social media giants? Thursday also marked 2 years in China since the death of a Chinese university student who was fatally misled by treatment information recommended by a popular Chinese search engine. How can global tech giants better serve their users while protecting their interests? Welcome to The Point with me, Liu Xin, and joining me for the discussion today in Beijing is Andy Mok, founder of Red Pagoda Resources, a recruiting firm providing talent for venture capital-backed internet companies in China. In Hong Kong, Rob Kebb, director of The Economist Corporate Network, and in Washington, D.C., Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Before we start the discussion, let's first begin by watching some key experts from the hearings. Here is one.
I think the real question, as the internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not.
But you as a company welcome regulation?
I think if it's the right regulation, then yes.
You think the Europeans have it right?
I think that they get things right.
Have you ever submitted? That's true.
Some would argue that a more regulatory environment might ultimately stifle new platforms and innovators. Some might describe as desperately needed competition.
On your point about regulation, the internet is growing in importance around the world in people's lives, and I think that it is inevitable that there will need to be some regulation. So my position is not that there should be no regulation, but I also think that you have to be careful about what regulation you put in place for a lot of the reasons that you're saying.
So these questions and answers are mostly centered around regulation. Andy, let me ask you first, what kind of regulations currently exist for social media platforms in the US and why they have apparently not worked?
Well, I think when we look at regulation for social media, it's important to look at this from a global perspective because these companies are global, and there's a lot to learn from other regimes around the world. So if we look at China, China has probably the most advanced regulatory regime that is primarily focused on protecting the population from harmful information. Of course, we can discuss the definition of what is harmful information. The second regulatory regime is the EU, where the primary focus is on protecting user privacy. And then finally, in the United States, it really has been much more laissez-faire and more reminiscent of, say, the UK light-touch financial regulation, meaning let's do as little as possible to keep out of the way of companies, let them innovate, let Silicon Valley do its thing. But we see now, of course, that philosophy does have its drawbacks, which is, I think, what has led to where we are today and Mark Zuckerberg's 2 days of testimony.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rob, we keep hearing the words like some regulation or the right regulation. What kind of regulation? So is Zuckerberg clear about what kind of regulation he is open to? And as U.S. lawmakers, are U.S. lawmakers clear about what kind of new regulations they think are needed?
I'm not really sure if they are. I think it was rather interesting how Zuckerberg, to his credit, acknowledged that regulation has a place. I mean, Silicon Valley, along the lines of what Andy was noting there, not just the U.S. system, but Silicon Valley specifically has a very libertarian ethos, and it often assumes that the government shouldn't do anything. So for a leading light of Silicon Valley to say he is not opposed to regulation is itself kind of a major thing. But he wasn't specific in the remarks that I heard. There is the Secure and Protect Americans Data Act, SPADA as it's referred to. That's actually been around for a couple of years, and maybe it will now get passed. But the biggest issue in all of this is simply that Facebook and the other companies haven't proven themselves to really do a good job of protecting data. In fact, spat came up in October 2017 when Equifax, a credit agency, a credit rating agency, had a breach of data as well. So it's a matter of, in Facebook's case, also going back to 2011, they had an earlier breach of data. The government said, okay, you can't do that anymore, make sure you're monitoring this. They said we will, and they didn't. So it's as much a matter of frameworks as it is enforcement. And I think both sides, legislators as well as companies, are kind of trying to find their way for what's the right formula here.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at the EU model a little bit here. Douglas, the EU's regulation concerning data protection will go into effect this May. From your understanding, how does this regulation work, and could it be emulated by the US?
Sure. Yeah, I think the interesting thing, the EU has always been far more strict. Back when I was at Homeland Security, I was part of the negotiation team working with the EU to try to bring into harmonization what we call PNR, passenger name records for aviation. And it all hinged on data. It all hinged on privacy. And the EU took a very strict role. One of the interesting things that we sort of broke through with them was the consumer tends to share a whole lot more than they like to acknowledge. For example, you apply for a credit card, you fill in huge amounts of data on a piece of paper, you fax it to an unknown place, you're okay with that. But when it comes to getting on an airplane, all of a sudden that changes. I think what Mark Zuckerberg is doing a couple of things. One is he had no choice but to give a little bit. They're under tremendous fire. The challenge will be he's dealing with a Congress that, in many of the questions that we saw, has so little understanding of what is going on in technology, so little understanding of the differences in the rules here versus the EU or anywhere else. And I think what we'll have to be cautious of is how fast that pendulum swings. Where it comes down to Facebook, I think the greatest irony in all of this, as we listen to that testimony, is the average citizen's willingness to put anything and everything up there. I'm having lunch at a cafe in Beijing. I'm doing this. Here's my kid at a birthday party. So the average user of Facebook is already putting just tremendous amounts of data up there. Hardly shocking, that so much of it is getting harvested in mined. What I do think we'll have to, the last point I would say on Facebook is, look, they were first to market to really succeed in this giant space. There were other players, but Facebook has been successful at knocking them out. In many ways, some increased regulation right now will probably only help to strengthen Facebook's position in the market and block out some other innovation. And so I think as we go through this next phase, we'll have to watch very cautiously.
Right. Andy, from what Douglas was talking about, was there anything that you agree or disagree? You want to add something here?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think that first of all, one of the big challenges I think that the United States faces in addressing these kinds of problems, and contrast it with China, is that the political system in the U.S., the political leadership is selected primarily based on popularity and not expertise and experience. So I think that, especially in technological fields, that American lawmakers have a little bit of a learning curve, whereas we look at a place like China or perhaps even the EU, that's a little bit different. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. I think the other point, too, is that when we look at Facebook, it started in Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room, and they started with very much a hacker's ethos, meaning let's build cool things, get it out there as quickly as possible. And I think for a certain point in Facebook's history, their mantra was move fast and break things. But I think now they're realizing that they're perhaps more like a public utility versus a startup, and that is going to require some fundamental changes in philosophy, procedures, policies, etc.
Now let's take a look at another clip about Facebook's business and privacy model. Let's take a listen to this.
Remember anything else from this hearing here today? Remember, we do nothing and we overreact. And we're getting ready to overreact, so I would suggest you go home and review all these other things people have accused you of today. Get with your good team, they're behind you. You're the guy to fix this. We're not. You need to save your ship.
Right, fix this is the message here. Rob, in Hong Kong, exactly whose responsibility is it to fix the problem? The government, the users, or the platforms as Facebook? Some lawmakers say self-regulation clearly isn't working, and others say it's Facebook's problem. So why the mixed messages here?
Well, this is an ongoing debate, of course, in political economics. It I would imagine goes back very classically in China with the treatise on iron and salt, for example, which was in the Han Dynasty, to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in the late 18th century. But these are all where there's always a debate about how much do you regulate and how much do you allow the market to act. The comments you just heard there from the American legislator was basically reflecting a conservative viewpoint that it's not the government's responsibility, it's companies' responsibility. And there is some truth to that. I mean, there is only so much laws can do if companies don't behave properly. To your question there, Liu Xin, about users, I think this is one of the biggest ironies in the whole makeup and why the framework of how we view usage on the internet just needs to undergo a kind of mind shift. And that is because before, just like Douglas was talking about, sharing photos or making comments, connecting with friends, all that information, that data has been out there in our personal lives, but now it's collected on this digital space, and we call it big data. We're calling it big data because of the volume of this information in one sense, but in another sense it's big because it's valuable. And so users actually have a lot of economic value at their fingertips, but they're not getting paid for it. So how do you deal with that? Companies want that data. Users want the convenience of these platforms, but no one's really figured out what the right mix is. So I think it's going to be an ongoing debate. There aren't clear answers. There does seem to be a consensus that despite the previous clip's comments from that one legislator, indeed there's going to be more regulation coming. But to what degree? Will it go as far as, say, within the Western mindset, there's the EU, which is very regulated, the U.S. not so much. The U.S. seems invariably going to adopt more regulation, but probably not as much as the EU. Which platform is better? It is true that the U.S. has more platform companies. In fact, the U.S. has the most platform companies in the world right now. So there's maybe something to be said for that laissez-faire attitude, too, in that regard.
Well, following Wednesday's hearing, House Commerce Chairman Greg Walden described it as a wake-up call for Silicon Valley and the tech community that if you let things get out of hand, having grown up in a very lightly regulated environment, then you could end up with a lot more regulation than you seek. So, Douglas, do you think the U.S. government has acted too slowly when it comes to regulating the tech industry? Is it too late to start applying regulations now?
Look, I think there have been very, very few members of the United States Congress that pay attention. I mean, one member, Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts, he's one of the sort of rare beacons in this space who's been paying aggressive attention for this for the last 15-plus years since the telecommunication laws were redone in this country. What I think will be most interesting, though, which will be faster, the government kind of over-moving and trying to over-regulate, or the consumer. We have an expression here in the United States called, vote with your feet. I think Facebook is seeing a significant backlash from its own users. And I think in many ways that will force them to change quicker than any sort of government regulation. A lot of people are saying, you know what, forget Facebook, I'm going off it, I'm turning it off, I'm not going to use it. And that will directly affect their model. Facebook makes their money from advertising. I mean, we've all known that. We've seen it ever more. What the hearing showed was just how much money they're making on it. And that money will be imperiled if all of a sudden their primary user, you, me, the rest of the guests in the show all say, you know what, we're getting off Facebook. And if that begins to happen, I think that will pressure them to do more than anything else. The challenge is, with technology here, it evolves so quickly. And government, particularly in the U.S., can't keep pace. And so it's got to be a little bit of give and take. It's got to be a little bit of the tech companies standing up and doing the right thing at the right time. Because what will happen is if government comes in, by the time they pass the regulation, it will already be outdated, and they'll have to look for something new.
Well, sometimes heavier prices have been paid. I mean, this month marks the 2-year anniversary of the death of Wei Zexi, a cancer patient who died at the age of 21 2 years ago after finding misleading treatment information on the Chinese search engine. The company has come under fire for allegedly breaching user privacy for commercial purposes and, in this case, promoting misleading information. So, Andy, what lessons have been learned in terms of tech companies' social responsibility, and has the situation improved now?
Well, I think what this shows is that no system is perfect. So as I mentioned earlier, China's regulatory regime on social media emphasizes more social stability, harmful information likely to affect the institutions of society and government, less focused on privacy. But I think what happened here in this instance was not so much a breach of privacy, but that it was really a fraudulent company that hurt an individual who made a bad decision, ended up dying as a result of that. So what I think has happened that has changed is that Baidu now has to more clearly distinguish what is paid advertising versus what's called organic search results, meaning that the results that their algorithms produce that aren't based on an advertiser paying for it. The second thing, I think that was a good thing, but also perhaps largely PR, is they set up a 1 billion RMB fund to compensate consumers, their users, that might have been damaged by these types of issues. And I think that there's a greater general awareness that this is an issue. So no system is perfect. I think China has done a very, very good job of anticipating the risk to institutions in a country from social media, but they've been doing a little bit of optimizing and catching up in terms of protecting individuals from fraudulent behavior online.
We're going to take a very short break and stay with us. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. We've been talking about Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's testimony to Congress this week over data privacy, regulation measures and content control. And my guests have been Andy Mark, founder of Red Pagoda Resources, Rob Kerr, director of the Economist Corporate Network, and Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Let's take a listen to another clip here.
What is Facebook doing to prevent foreign actors from interfering in U.S. elections?
One of my greatest regrets in running the company is that we were slow in identifying the Russian information operations in 2016. We expected them to do a number of more traditional cyber attacks, which we did identify and notify the campaigns that they were trying to hack into them, but we were slow at identifying the type of new information operations.
When did you identify new operations?
It was right around the time of the 2016 election itself.
Now, U.S. midterm elections are coming up, and there is concern over how the social media platforms will influence the elections. Zuckerberg mentioned that the company will use more AI and bring on an additional 20,000 employees in this regard. Rob, in Hong Kong, will such tools work in your eyes?
We'll have to see. I mean, it's one thing to say you're taking these measures. You know, there's also been a lot of commentary recently about, and in fact from Zuckerberg himself, that this is a kind of state of war, information wars, where one side adopts measures or countermeasures and another side finds a way to respond to that. So it's good that they're doing these things, I won't deny that, but you wonder what's going on in Moscow in terms of a counter response to that. I mean, I think a bigger issue here, if we want to look at it at a societal level, is this kind of gullibility that people have for fake news, and it's a deeper issue with the way the internet has functioned, not so much as a provider for information, but a confirmation of personally held beliefs. So you've seen a kind of balkanization, meaning you've had these camps emerge where people kind of coalesce around ideas they like, and that transcends all these other issues we're talking about. That's just something that I think individuals in every society need to think about. And do you want to look for fact-based information, or do you just want to have your beliefs confirmed? But anyway, what Facebook will be able to do coming up to the midterm elections, we'll have to see. Hopefully it'll be more effective than what they pulled off in 2016.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, Zuckerberg said himself that this is an arms race, but Douglas, will there ever be a mechanism in place to effectively prevent fake news, misinformation, meddling or hate speeches, or is this going to be a necessary evil?
I think it will be a necessary evil. I mean, the weakest link in this is the consumer. You know, I think if Facebook or any of the platforms really wanted to do something proactive, yes, it's wonderful they're hiring 20,000 people. But if they really wanted to do something effective on their own nickel, they would be much more aggressive at trying to educate the consumer on, hey, before you just believe this, here are 3 tips you can use to double check the story is true. There was a horrible story in the heat of the campaign in 2016 about a pizza parlor in Washington that Michael Flynn, the now disgraced National Security Advisor's son, pushed out there, purporting this a child sex ring. It was completely made up. But what the story did is it drove a deranged gunman from North Carolina to drive up to Washington and potentially take violence out on an innocent facility. You know, I think that the biggest thing that Facebook and the other platforms need to do is be far more aggressive of sort of public service announcements, because I think your other guest is absolutely right. The typical consumer is so gullible. We're still going to get those emails from your rich uncle in Nigeria saying, click here, you could get $10 million. It is shocking to me from my time at DHS and in my time since then, just how willing people are to believe what they see online and what they're willing to do with it, to click through. It is really a shocking thing, and I think that's going to be the hardest thing. AI can only go so far. 20,000 new people at Facebook can only go so far. And look, regulation from the United States government is probably going to be the least effective. It's really going to require a concentrated collaboration between the government, the consumer, and these technology companies if we want to continue to battle this back.
Right.
But
I think one of the
challenges
challenges
I would say is you put up a high wall.
Yeah, I think one of the
challenges
here is that a lot of these matters are quite subjective. Andy, by what principles should social media platforms use to monitor, on the part of them, to monitor and control the content that is being posted, shared, and digested? Who decides what's to be kept?
Well, I think that's a great question, but I think the issue here we have to recognize is this really wasn't a wake-up call to Silicon Valley. It was a wake-up call to Capitol Hill, because what really instigated all of this angst, I think, is the Russian interference. And to go back to Rob's point that the average consumer is gullible, I can't help but think of what H.L. Mencken said about democracy being the worship of jackals by jackasses. And that what we see then as a feature in democracy where everyone gets a vote, and the average person, by definition, is average, that it seems hard to avoid these kinds of problems. The other point I want to make about this, too, is that one man's content review is another man's censor. So in Facebook hiring 20,000 people for content review, I mean, it's ironic that I think the U.S. has disparaged China for early seeing these problems and having companies hire people to review content to make sure that it does not disrupt society or undermine the institutions of society or government. So I think that, what do these social platforms need to do? I think a lot really will depend on the response of government.
Right. Another very important thing is the way how such user terms are communicated. Let's take a look at the clip about Facebook's user agreement and how well Facebook, or how badly Facebook is seen to have communicated how users' data is being used.
Here's what everybody's been trying to tell you today, and I say this gently. Your user agreement sucks. You can spot me 75 IQ points. If I can figure it out, you can figure it out. The purpose of that user agreement is to cover Facebook's rear end. It's not to inform your users about their rights. Now, you know that, and I know that. I'm going to suggest to you that you go back home and rewrite it. Are you willing, as a Facebook user, are you willing to give me more control over my data?
Senator, as someone who uses Facebook, I believe that you should have complete control over your data.
So, Rob, let me ask you this. Why are these user agreements always so complicated that it is really painful to imagine that you have to read it and understand it before signing it? Are they designed to perplex the users, or is it because of its legal nature that it has to be so complicated?
I think your latter point is valid there. I mean, I don't deny the cynical interpretation that was given by Mark Zuckerberg, its questioner in that session. But honestly, I mean, companies, particularly in the United States, and we can go back to some of Andy's points, he gives a very statist interpretation of society. Democracy is an evolutionary form of government. Even in China, of course, there's 富强民主. Democracy is the second principle of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So I think there's an acceptance that democracy is something people aspire to. But then the question is, how do you really let people, even average people, have control? It's encouraging that Zuckerberg says, I want to give you complete control. But the question centered around, well, then you have this very complex user agreement. And to your point, Liu Xin, yeah, I really do think, particularly in the United States, the reasons we have these extraordinarily complex user agreements, whether it's you're buying a car or you're buying almost anything, a commercial transaction, and then especially in terms of user agreements with software, there are all sorts of caveats that company lawyers put in there primarily to protect companies from liability. And we have a very distorted system known as tort law that allows for huge sums to be paid when you sue a company. Not that companies shouldn't be responsible, but I think it's been abused. And in America, if there is one major area of fault that a lot of people would agree with, is that our democracy has become very beholden to special interest and a legalistic process as opposed to a more pragmatic process to things. So anyway, we could have a whole separate debate around that, but I think that gets to the heart of why these user agreements are so complex, and people don't know how to control their data the way they should be able to.
Right. Well, if Zuckerberg goes home and rewrites the user agreement, Douglas, how different would that agreement look? Try to keep your answers short, please.
I'll keep it super short. They should have it in gigantic font that when it opens up it says user beware. And I think that sort of solves the problem. I mean, anyone on Facebook needs to know if you use it and you're willing to be on it, all of your data could be compromised. And I think if they just spelled that out right up front, that would solve a lot of the problems.
Okay.
How's that for short?
That was short. Andy, the CEO of that Chinese tech company that we mentioned earlier recently said that Chinese people have low sensitivity toward privacy issues. They are willing to trade privacy for convenience, for safety, and for efficiency in general. So to your understanding, is privacy an illusion? If you use social media and the internet, are you signing away your data privacy by default? Or should you be doing that?
Well, I think that Robin Lee's point about this from Baidu is not just true for Chinese users, but for American users as well, because Americans will say convenience before death, right? I mean, we care a lot about convenience, getting things for free. So I think that's true globally. But I think one of the issues around privacy in China is that there are cultural reasons. We think about China's 5,000 years of history, primarily oriented around the family unit, around the clan unit, which is very different from the U.S. or Western Europeans. It's more centered around the individual. So I think there are fundamentally different notions of privacy. And of course that can change over time, but I think that's one factor. I think also just China as well, that given the system here, I think that there's also a less expectation of privacy as well.
Finally, on some general atmosphere question about these hearings, Rob, really quickly, how would you grade Zuckerberg's performance?
I was actually surprised. I thought it was refreshing. I thought he was very honest. You can talk about as a corporate leader if he did enough to defend his company, but I thought it was good from my perspective, and it's good for the debate we're having along this topic, as is your program tonight, Liu Xin. So yeah, overall good.
Yeah, but some people are saying he's too stoic. Andy, 20 seconds, please.
I thought he was very statesmanlike, and again, if we think where did Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg start with this hacker ethos, I think he's really grown into this role and recognized the global impact that he and his company has and is working to address these issues.
Douglas, your 10-second answer to this?
Yeah, no, I thought it was excellent. I mean, I think he was facing a really tough audience and he listened. But look, he sits in rarefied territory. He represents over 1 billion users. There's only 5 things in the world with over 1 billion things.
We have to leave it
there. Population of China, population of India.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my 3 guests, and that is it for this special edition of The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.